Just to give you a reminder of where we are, and for anybody new who was not around for the first half, we finished walking through our whirlwind tour of various applications of crowdsourcing in different domains. So we had direct applications to machine learning and data mining. We saw some examples of hybrid intelligence systems, and we saw some examples of user studies to understand behavior of users in various systems. We started the second half of the tutorial, which is on understanding, kind of opening up this black box of crowdsourcing and understanding that there are in fact people inside, and looking at research on various aspects of crowd workers themselves. So we just finished talking about a couple of studies to do with honesty of crowd workers, and now we're going to pick back up again with a discussion of monetary incentives. So talking a little bit about how much to pay workers first, and then talking about some studies looking at the effects of various types of payments on quality of crowd working. Okay. So let me start with a very simple question of just how much people should pay for crowd working tasks. This is something where there's not actually, I'm not going to base my answer here on existing research. I just want to kind of give you an idea of the sense that I've gotten from talking to a lot of people in the crowdsourcing community and various rules of thumb that people use. This is actually something that I think the kind of opinion in the community has changed on a lot over the years. So, when crowdsourcing first became an option, you would see all of these papers that said, like, this is fantastic, we can pay people basically nothing and get all of this like super dirt cheap labor. And, this is kind of frowned upon now, this attitude. People have, more and more come to realize that crowd workers are, actually people, many of them who are trying to make their living this way, and people have sort of adjusted their opinions otherwise. So the general consensus now among people who do a lot of work with crowdsourcing is to try to aim to pay at least minimum wage. So on a platform like Mechanical Turk, that would usually mean US minimum wage, because as we saw, 70 or 80% of the workers there are in the US. This is not a legal requirement. Crowd workers are, not officially workers, so you're not legally required to do this, but it's just kind of the decent thing to do. And so the rule of thumb that I generally see, and that I try to do in all of my own work where I'm doing, using crowd workers, is to first take your experiment or task, other type of task, and pilot it on, your students, your colleagues, your friends, or just a small number of workers, and try to get a sense of how long it takes people, how long it takes the slowest people, and so on. And using the results of this pilot, try to adjust your payments accordingly so that whatever fixed payment that you're giving will work out to something like the US minimum wage. So this is basically what I always try to do myself. And I think that there are kind of two different types of benefits to this. One is that it's just like the decent thing to do because, crowd workers are doing work for us and we want to be supporting them, and some of them are really trying to make their living this way. So it's a nice thing to do. Also, if you want to think about things kind of from the more selfish perspective, I think that this actually does help requesters in the long run, because this is a good way to maintain good relationships with workers. And as we'll talk about a little bit later, workers actually do pay attention to who the good requesters are. They talk to each other about who the good requesters are, and so on. So, even if you don't care directly about doing the decent thing here, it also is kind of in your best interest to maintain a good relationship with workers, and paying well is one way to do this. So that's my general rule of thumb on just basic payments. I'm going to focus mostly in this section on exploring one particular type of payments, which are performance-based payments, and looking at whether these improve the quality of crowd work. And in the first half of this tutorial, the entire first segment of this tutorial, I didn't talk about any of my own work. Here, actually, I'm going to be talking about some of my own work. And I'm going to go into this particular study that we did on performance-based payments in a tiny bit more detail than I've gone into some of the other studies. And the reason for that is that, because this is work that I know well, I know a lot about kind of what went on behind the scenes here. And I think that this is kind of a good illustration of many different things that you might want to keep in mind if you're trying to run your own behavioral experiment or similar on Mechanical Turk. So I'll go into this in slightly more detail just to kind of give you a sense of like various bumps that we ran into, various things that you should be keeping in mind if you're running your own experiments here. And because it tells us something interesting about this question of payments and how and when we might expect this type of payment to improve quality of crowd work. It's kind of interesting for two reasons. All right, so what do I mean by performance-based payments here? So performance-based payments basically are payments that reward people higher when they're doing high-quality work. So just as one example, you can imagine some task where you show somebody some text and ask them to proofread it. And you might pay them, say, 50 cents for doing this. This is kind of the standard type of payment. It's just a fixed payment. A performance-based payment here would be, you could think of as some type of bonus, say, earn an extra 10 cents for every typo found or something like this. So you might, list this task as with some base payment, but then pay an additional amount of money on top of that for higher quality work. So this is the type of thing that I have in mind when I'm talking about performance-based payments. So when we started looking at performance-based payments, we were interested in whether these could improve the quality of crowd work because there are notoriously a lot of problems with crowd quality. We wanted to know kind of what else had been done in this area, like what was known. And we found that at the time that we were thinking about this work, this was in 2015, the existing literature was a little bit kind of scattered. So there are a few pieces of work that suggested that paying more increases the quality of work, increases the quantity of work, so people will do more, but not the quality. And I'll come back to this point a little bit later. There was some work looking specifically at performance-based payments that claimed that, at least in some circumstances, they do improve quality. And there's other work claiming that these types of performance-based payments do not improve quality at all. And finally, there was some work claiming that if you're going to give these types of bonus, the size of the bonus that you give doesn't matter at all, which we found a little bit strange. And so we kind of wanted to make sense of these results and kind of get a bigger picture of, not just how these payments work in one specific scenario, but sort of when they might work, where they might work, why they might work. Kind of a more holistic view of how and when we might be able to use these payments to improve the quality of crowd work. And again, like most of the rest of the work that I'm going to be talking about, we are looking specifically at Amazon Mechanical Turk here, though I would suspect that many of these findings would apply well in other crowdsourcing platforms too. But we didn't look at other platforms. So in order to kind of get this picture, we ran a series of behavioral experiments, which are basically user studies like the type that I talked about in the first half of the talk, except that the particular users we were interested in here were crowd workers. So we were kind of applying this methodology of using Mechanical Turk to run behavioral studies to understand a system to understand like the crowdsourcing system itself. So we ran a couple of experiments here. The first one that I'll talk about was a little bit of a warm-up, or you could even call this kind of an extended pilot study, in which we just wanted to verify that we could find some task where these performance-based payments did lead to higher quality work. So again, this is not, the end goal in itself. We just wanted to reassure ourselves that we could, if we tried to find something where we really thought that they would work, we could find some task where they would lead to higher quality work. And at the same time, we wanted to test this hypothesis that we had that there may already be some sort of what we call an implicit performance-based payment going on Mechanical Turk. And the idea here is that although this doesn't happen very often, requesters on Mechanical Turk actually do have the option of rejecting work, in which case the worker won't get paid. And people do not do this very often. It's actually pretty bad for workers if their work gets rejected, because then their official approval rate will go down, and this will kind of prevent them from doing certain tasks. So it doesn't happen very much. But we had this theory that maybe people are already kind of implicitly thinking that their work is performance-based, because there's always this idea in the back of their mind that their work could get rejected. So we wanted to sort of test that out as well. So the way that we set this up is we created a task where we asked workers to proofread an article and find the spelling errors in the article. The articles that we showed them were actually images of text so that they couldn't just copy and paste the text into a spell check and get the answers easily. We randomly inserted 20 typos into this text from a list of common English language typos. And then we gave them this image. And this task has a couple of useful properties. So one is that quality is really easily measurable here. In particular, we inserted all of these typos ourselves, so we know exactly what the list of typos are, and we can check that they've found these. And this also has this useful property that we wanted to explore, and that I'll talk about a little bit later, that exerting more effort here should lead to better results. At least we had this intuitive impression that if people spend more time on this task, they should be finding more typos. And based on both intuition and the economics literature on just labor in general, these types of performance-based payments we thought might do well on tasks where exerting more effort actually leads to better quality. So this is the task we looked at. We paid workers a base payment of 50 cents and a bonus payment of $1 for this task. Again, this base payment was determined in this method that I talked about earlier, where we ran some pilots and figured out kind of how long it was taking workers to do the task and aimed to pay minimum wage in our base payment. Then we ran a 3x2 design here. So we had first each worker assigned to one of 3 bonus treatments. In the no bonus treatment, they would get no bonus or no mention of a bonus. So they would just get this base payment of 50 cents for doing the task. In the bonus for all treatment, they would get the bonus unconditionally. So basically, they would be getting $1.50 for completing the task. We would have preferred to just be able to offer them $1.50 up front, but we wanted everybody to kind of see the same task going in and then be able to do the randomization after they had accepted. So instead, we just gave them this extra bonus of $1 as soon as they accepted. And in our performance-based payment treatments, we gave workers the bonus if they found at least 75% of the typos that were found by other workers. We picked this type of relative threshold for 2 reasons. So one is that we could have just asked them to find all 20 typos, but we didn't really want to give away the fact that we had inserted the typos into this text ourselves and therefore knew how many typos there were. And second, because this is the type of bonus that somebody could actually implement if they were running this task for real and didn't know behind the scenes how many typos there were. In addition to these 3 bonus treatments, we had 2 different base treatments. So everybody was randomly assigned to one of these and one of these. So we had a guaranteed base treatment in which we actually told workers as soon as they accepted the hit that if they found at least 1 typo, we were going to pay them. And it was pretty easy to find one. And then we had a condition where we did not guarantee the base. which is kind of the standard condition. You wouldn't normally make this type of guarantee. And again, the purpose of including these treatments was to get at this sort of implicit performance-based payment effect. So let me show you the results of this kind of warm-up experiment. So we tried this on 1,000 workers. Here I'm showing number of typos found with no bonus, immediate bonus of $1, and the performance-based payment. And the lighter colors here are the guaranteed base, the darker are the not guaranteed. Note that this is starting at 9 typos and going only a little over 12. So this is not like quite as huge of a difference as it looks in the picture, but there is kind of a significant difference there still. A couple of things to note here. So first, guaranteeing the payments hurts. So this implicit performance-based payment effect seems to be real, right? We get fewer typos when we're not guaranteeing the base payment. Performance-based payments do, in fact, improve quality. So there's a big jump between not having a bonus and having performance-based payments, or at least a significant jump, if not, depends on your particular task if this would be considered big or not. And unlike in prior work, we actually found that just paying more improved quality in this task. So when we gave the bonus to everybody, it still improved quality here. So that was kind of interesting, and I'll maybe say a little bit more about why we think this is the case a little later. So this was good for our warm-up. We did indeed find this one task where performance-based payments were helping, and it does seem like this implicit PBP effect is real. So then we wanted to get a broader sense of how specific these results are to this example, and whether these applied more broadly. So we first tried varying some of the parameters here. So we looked first at varying the bonus threshold. So here we had the same task, same 50-cent base, same dollar bonus, but now instead of asking people to find 75% of the typos found by others, we also tried asking people to find 25% of the typos found by others, to find all of the typos found by others, or to just find 5 typos. And what we saw is kind of interesting. So here we have the control where there was no bonus. We have the 5 typos, 25%, 75%, and all. If you can't see, the scale is going from 10 to 14 here. So what do we see here? Well, first, kind of reassuringly, we found that performance-based payments are actually working for a wide range of thresholds. So it wasn't so specific to the 75%. In fact, 25% and 75% are actually really similar. And this, I think, is reassuring if you want to try to pay people based on quality in practice, because it would be worrisome if you had to make sure that you got the threshold exactly right in order to see good results. So it's nice that you don't have to worry too much about that. Yeah, so that's, we thought is actually kind of interesting. It seems like this is telling us in some sense that having like a subjective belief about how good the work that you need to do the payment is can actually maybe help, because we had inserted 20 typos, so 25% of 20 typos is 5 typos. But when people were asked to find 5 typos as opposed to 25% of the typos, they actually did much worse. And this is not quite statistically significant here, but it seems like they're actually doing a little bit worse than the control treatment in this case. Which is interesting. And we can't say anything for sure about why this is, but our speculation is that it might is that when they have this cutoff of 5 typos, that gives them like this focal point, and they kind of know at that point that they're already going to get the bonus, so kind of why bother doing more? So the subjective seems to work pretty well.
Obviously, you could give them 20, but it also might be interesting to ask for 4 and see what happens.
Yeah, we thought about doing that. I mean, we didn't want to give them an impossible to complete task, for one thing, that kind of thing is harder to get by IRBs than the rest of this. But yeah, I mean, it is possible that if we had set the threshold to 20 instead of 5, well, actually, I don't know. I mean, so people, when we asked them to find all of the typos, they also did, a little bit worse than when we asked for 75%. And it could be that if you ask them to do too much in some sense, then they also give up because it's not achievable. But we didn't try that, so I don't know for sure. Okay. So this is good news in the sense that the threshold is not super sensitive. We also played around a little bit with the bonus amount to see how much of an effect that was having. So here we kept our 50-cent base and we kept the 75% of typos threshold, but we changed the amount of the bonus. So we looked at 5 cents, 50 cents, and $1. And this is what we found. So this 0 is the control where there's just no mention of a bonus, and this is 5 cents, 50 cents, and $1. And these results are interesting, I think, because they actually shed some light on this prior work that I mentioned earlier that was a little bit mysterious to us at first. And in particular, I mentioned this one paper that had this claim that performance-based payments don't work. And in that paper, they actually were offering a 3-cent bonus on a 30-cent task. So it could be that they're just in this regime over here where their payment is so low that it's not motivating people. And on the other hand, we didn't see a huge difference between 50 cents and $1 as the payment. And we think this could explain this other paper that I mentioned that had this result that the size of the bonus payment didn't matter, because in that paper, they were only looking at bonuses that were pretty big compared with the base. So it could be the case that sort of once you get big enough that the bonus is salient to people, then increasing it a little more doesn't make that much of a difference. So that's kind of nice. Good. So the last part of this that I want to talk about is an experiment that we did to look at which kinds of tasks these payments work on. So so far, everything that I've been showing is for this proofreading task. But we wanted to know, are there properties of a task that might lead these payments to work better or worse? And here I want to mention that part of this experiment was actually motivated by what, at the time we were running it, we thought was kind of a failed pilot experiment. I'm bringing this up because, this is not like something that we would write in a paper, but I am bringing it up because I think that, especially for experiments, but for any type of Mechanical Turk task, piloting is super important. I'm going to return to that point many times and try to drill this in. And I think that in some cases you can actually get really insightful results from pilots that go wrong. So this was one case where initially when we were kind of playing around and trying to find this one task that performance-based payments do well on, where we ended up with proofreading, we had tried some experiments on audio transcription, and we kind of thought that audio transcription should have this property that if you spent more time, you would do better. But when we tried performance-based payments on this, we found that they were actually not improving quality at all, and we were a little bit puzzled by this. And so when we were thinking later about what types of tasks these payments might work on, we kind of came back to this and came back to our theory that they should work well for these effort-responsive tasks. It should be the case that if you can't improve the quality of your work by putting in effort, then these payments are certainly not going to help, right? And if you can improve the quality of your work by putting in effort, then you would think that people who want to pay more would put in more effort and do it. So we came back and wanted to study this a little bit more. The problem is that, as we found with audio transcription, it may not always be totally straightforward to guess which tasks are effort responsive. And so just as a little check here, we tried a few different tasks, so things like proofreading and things like audio transcription, handwriting recognition. And to try to get some sense of whether or not they actually were effort responsive, we just ran a bunch of these tasks with no bonus or anything, and just plotted basically the amount of time that people put in versus their overall accuracy. And we found that for some of the tasks that we looked at, this was like clearly going up, whereas for other tasks that we looked at, actually including this audio transcription where we weren't seeing good results before, this wasn't really going up at all. It was basically pretty flat. And it turned out that when we ran some experiments with performance-based payments on these tasks, we found that for the ones where we were seeing this kind of positive slope, where putting in more time was actually helping people do better, the performance-based payments were working for us. They were improving quality. Whereas when we weren't seeing this relationship, we were getting results that the performance-based payments weren't working. So this is totally not conclusive. It's just a few different tasks that we tried where this relationship tends to hold. But our theory, at least, is that it should be the case that on tasks that are effort responsive, putting in more or having performance-based payments will actually encourage people to put in more effort and therefore do higher quality work. This hasn't made it onto my slides yet, but there's actually some recent work that came out that I saw that was kind of building on this idea and looking at whether this effort responsiveness property actually matters when people are talking about whether or not just simply paying more improves quality in tasks. And it seems like that might be the case there too. So if that's true, it could potentially explain why in our experiments that we were seeing that just paying more without any performance-based bonus leads to higher quality when other people didn't see that. So that is all I want to say about those experiments. A couple takeaways from this section. So first, as I mentioned, I think it's generally considered good practice to aim to pay at least minimum wage. If you're using something like Mechanical Turk, where most workers are in the US, I would go for US minimum wage here. And if you're not sure how long your task is going to take, you can always pilot it on friends, students, or a few workers to find out and set your payments accordingly. There's some evidence that we saw that you can improve quality with performance-based payments if you want to, if you have a task that's effort responsive. And again, piloting your task to figure out the relationship between the time that people spend and the quality is a good way to figure out if you actually have one of these effort responsive tasks, because it might not be obvious. And finally, if you do want to use these types of payments, the bonus payment needs to be large enough relative to the base that it's meaningful to people, but the precise amount, and it seems the precise criteria that you use for deciding whether someone gets the bonus don't matter too much. Okay. Yes?
Is it a performance correlated with the demographics of respondents? That people in the higher income group might be less sensitive to the question, the bonus question?
That is a good question, but not something that we looked at specifically. But I could see that being I could imagine that being the case, especially, if you're looking at a platform like Mechanical Turk, where you have some workers from the US and some workers from India, and the workers in India are making significantly less money, it could be the case that, they might be especially sensitive to these things, but that is, that's not something that we specifically looked at, so I can't say for sure. Okay. Yes?
How would you approach incentivizing workers in scenarios where you don't have a notion of ground truth? So in all of these scenarios, they are effort-based, but you also have some notion of ground truth in order to evaluate their performance and compare. But what if it's something like preference-based or opinion-based or something like that without ground truth? How would you incentivize?
Yeah, so that's a really good question. So there's been a fair amount of theoretical work, not as much applied, but a large amount of theoretical work looking at the question of how to kind of pay people based on performance when there's no ground truth, but you are answering some objective type of question. And there's this entire literature and these peer prediction techniques where you basically, so at a very hand-wavy, high level, in addition to having people report what they think the answer is, you have them report kind of what they think other people are going to say for the same question, and then you can kind of use these two reports to come up with a way to make it sort of truthful in the sense that it's in people's best interest to report what they think the right label is. They get paid the most in this case. I'm being extremely hand-wavy here because I don't want to go into all of the details, but there is like kind of a big literature there, although these techniques, I don't really see them being used in practice so much, although people do occasionally. But those are still questions where there is an objective answer, you just don't know what the objective answer is. I think if you're in a scenario where you're really going for people's preferences or something like that, it seems much harder and probably a good open research question to figure out how to do that. Yeah, at least with money. I mean, there are other, I'm going to talk next about intrinsic motivation, and you could certainly use like some of those types of techniques, but it's hard to figure out how you would do that with money. Okay. Good, great questions. So okay, so that was all I was going to say about monetary payments here. Let me move on and talk a little bit about a couple of types of intrinsic motivation, or ways that people have found to kind of improve quality without paying more necessarily. So the first work that I want to talk about is some work that was done by Chandler and Kapelner, and they were experimenting to see how the quality and quantity of crowd workers' work changed when workers believed that they were doing something that mattered as opposed to something that maybe doesn't matter so much. So they ran a controlled experiment where they had 3 treatments. In all of them, they basically gave workers some sort of image, and they had to label something about the image. But in their control treatment, they didn't give any context at all for what workers were doing in this task. They just kind of described it to them as an image labeling task, but didn't give them any kind of motivating story behind it. In their meaningful condition, they told workers that they were labeling tumor cells to assist medical researchers, but the rest of the task was exactly the same. They just had this motivating story behind it. And then in their third shredded condition, not only did they not give this motivating story, but they also directly told workers that their work was just going to be discarded after they did it. Nobody was going to look at their results at all. So this was a very demotivating condition here. And they found a couple of interesting things. So on this particular task, they found that when they looked at the meaningful condition compared with the control, the quantity of work that people did went up, but the quality of work that people did was still pretty similar to what it was in the control. So I should say here, they did only try this on this one task, so I don't know how specific to this particular task is, but it's kind of interesting that at least on this particular task, giving people this nice story really encouraged them to do more work, but it didn't lead to a quality improvement as you might think it would. Kind of on the flip side, when they looked at it's dying on me. They looked at the shredded condition compared with the control, the quality of work actually went down. So people were just not trying as hard as you might expect because no one was going to look at their work anyway. But the quantity of work that they did was similar compared to the control. So people were still willing to come in and do this task where they were told their work was going to be thrown away because it was a fine task to do. They were still getting paid for it. But they didn't try as hard. But somehow, when they were made to believe that this was really meaningful, they were willing to stick around and do more work. So I think that's kind of interesting. And, maybe it's not surprising that giving people meaningful work leads them to do more, as this is kind of what the entire, citizen science industry is based around, right? So there are all of these citizen science sites like Zooniverse, which apparently has had, as of a couple of weeks when I took the screenshot, more than 65 million classifications done by 1.5 million registered volunteers who have all come in and do this for free because they kind of like the fact that they are contributing to science, right? So I think this kind of motivation of telling people that they're actually doing, that the task that they're doing is not, meaningless, it actually has this great social impact, can be really motivating for people. And this is useful to know if your task is actually doing good for the world. I do not encourage people to pretend that their task is, for the good of the world if it's actually not. But it's useful if your task is doing good, then let people know. The second type of intrinsic motivation that I want to mention is gamification. So the idea of making your tasks fun, which I think is something that people don't pay enough attention to. I think in general, when people run tasks on crowdsourcing sites, they don't pay enough attention either to how fun their task is, or just basic things like user interface, which these things actually do make a big deal for how many people will come to your task and how long they'll stick around and all of this. People want to be working on things that are fun and easy and, not running into user interface problems and all of this. So kind of the classic example of gamification for crowdsourcing is the work of Vaughan and Dabish from back in 2004, the ESP game. People know the ESP game? I thought everybody knew about this until recently because it was everybody was doing it back when I was in grad school, but apparently I'm just old and nobody knows about this anymore. But yeah. But so the ESP game was this game that was designed in order to kind of focus people's attention that they would otherwise be putting into video games that have no purpose into a task that is actually useful. So in particular, this was something that Vaughan and Dabish created as a way to get people to label images for them. And they wanted people to do this for free. And so they decided to do this by making it fun, right? And so the way that this game worked is that you would go to their website, you would be matched up with a partner, and once you're matched up with a partner, this timer would start going, and you and your partner would both be showed the same image, and you would have to kind of agree on a word. So you could type in a bunch of guesses of words, and you would kind of win and go on to the next image when you and your partner typed in the same word. So the way they gamified this, they kind of made it fun for people. But at the same time, in order to agree on a word for an image, sort of your best strategy is to write down a word that actually describes what's in that image. So at the same time, they're sort of naturally getting people to label these images for them. And they added all sorts of bells and whistles, so they won't have just everybody who comes in typing dog. Once they have enough pairs of people who have entered the same word, they add these words as taboo words, and now you're not allowed to enter those words anymore. You have to come up with new words that other people haven't found. And they did all sorts of other tricks to make this more fun. So for example, I mentioned that they have a timer, and there's actual research out there that shows that if you give people time limits that are not too difficult, then this can kind of add to how fun and addictive a game is. Similarly, they had scores that you could build up over time so that you and your partner could end up on this leaderboard and so on. So they really tried as much as they could to turn this into something that would be fun for people to do, so that people would come and basically label images for them for free. So give you another example. Vaughan actually has a whole old research agenda with this. He was calling it games with a purpose. Another example of a game that came out of that line of work is this game Verbosity. Here they were basically getting people to come in and give a bunch of descriptive sentences about terms to them, which they could then use in other research projects. So here there are, again, people are matched up in pairs, but one person is now playing a different role than the other. One person is kind of the guesser, and the other person is giving them clues. So here, the secret word is sock. Basically, they want people to generate lots of sentences about socks for them, which is a pretty boring task to do on its own. But here they're trying to get their partner to guess the secret word as fast as possible. So they're typing in things like it's related to feet, it's a kind of clothing, and they're trying to kind of get their partner to guess. And again, this sort of works for the data collection purpose because, if you want your partner to be able to guess, sort of your best strategy here is to type in sentences that actually really accurately describe socks in this case. And somehow they've made this really boring task into something that's fun to do. And again, here they have these same elements of a score and a time limit and all of this. So these are examples of cases where they were kind of able to make these crowdsourcing tasks sufficiently fun that they didn't even have to pay people to do these. People were just willing to come and do them on their own, and they collected a lot of data this way. But I think that even if you don't want to devote enough time and energy to turn your crowdsourcing task into something that is going to be fun enough for people to come do, which is, I think, a very, very difficult thing to do. I think it's still useful to keep in mind that even with paid crowdsourcing, the more fun that you can make your tasks, the happier people are going to be to do them. And so, even if you're paying people, it's still good to keep in mind that you want to make it a good experience for them. Yes?
Is there a platform or site to follow that kind of free crowdsourcing test? Or if we want to develop something like that and post it and find people, workers to try it, is there a platform or a website that provides such tools?
That is a really good question. I've mostly seen people kind of launching these things on their own and then trying to recruit via Facebook or things like that, but I don't think that works terribly well in general. Some people have luck with it, but it's hard to make your crowdsourcing game go viral. I think there are some platforms. There's a volunteer science platform out of Northeastern where they let various people run experiments, but I don't know if they will just let anybody come and use their platform or if you have to be somehow affiliated with their group. But mostly I see people kind of launching these things on their own, which is really difficult. Yeah. Yes?
Has there been any research of the combination of gamification and pay? And I ask because I know with kids that if you pay them, they stop doing things for fun. So that's one of the recommendations, don't pay your kid to read, they'll stop reading for fun.
Yeah. Yeah. I haven't seen any work along those lines, but it's a really good point, and I think it would be something worth looking into, for sure. Yeah. It might be a little bit different in this context. If you're talking about, people who are on a crowdsourcing platform trying to make money anyway, then, maybe they would be, if their goal is to make money, then maybe they would be happy to do this in a fun, gamified way as opposed to doing some other potentially more boring task. So the psychology behind it could be a little bit different just because their goal is different, but it's a good question. Okay.
Saying that Wikipedia and Wikidata, they don't like it all.
The what?
They don't like it all, the notification reject it. You were saying about notification.
Wikipedia, you're saying, does?
You could do a plugin, you propose it to the community, they say no, because we should have a different kind of drive.
Mm-hmm.
Drive is to gain some points, and it's you shouldn't be here.
Yeah, interesting. I didn't know that. Yeah. I guess it depends. I feel like whether or not gamification works or is a good idea is pretty task dependent again. I mean, like for the types of tasks that they're looking at here, these are things where, first they're just not very fun to do without the gamification aspect. So you need some way to motivate people, be it money or making it fun. But second, they're kind of things that you don't need specialized knowledge like you need for Wikipedia, and there are things where they were able to design this so that they actually have some sort of kind of correctness test built in where, it shouldn't be the case that your opponent can guess that you're talking about socks if you write some sentence that is totally meaningless and not at all about socks. So they can kind of throw away your data if your opponent is not able to guess what you're actually talking about. So it's kind of nice that in these examples there is this like built-in check. Although, I mean, you could still imagine ways that people could kind of collude and game these things, but I think it doesn't happen very much. Yeah. Okay. So just a couple of takeaways from that section. So first, going back to the first example of intrinsic motivation, we saw that at least on some types of tasks, workers produce more work when they know they're performing a task that's meaningful, but it might be the case that the quality of their work doesn't improve, even though they're excited to do more of it. And we've seen that gamification can also increase productivity, and using kind of well-known gamification techniques like well-calibrated timed responses and scorekeeping, either with or without some sort of leaderboard or high score list, can increase people's enjoyment and make them more excited to do this task. Okay. Good. So let me move on to the last kind of big piece of research that I wanted to talk about. This is also something that came out of my own research, joint with a fantastic intern we had, Ming Yin, as well as Mary Gray and Sid Suri. And this is work looking at the kind of communication structure of crowd workers on Mechanical Turk. And the idea going into this was that, there's kind of this implicit assumption that people make when they are using crowdsourcing that crowd workers are all independent. So basically you kind of go to some crowdsourcing platform and you're getting these like independent workers from all over the world answering your questions. And people don't usually talk about this assumption, but the fact that they're using crowd workers for things like evaluating whether some algorithm is good or bad, these are all kinds of tasks where normally you would want to assume that the data points that you're getting are independent. Right? But there's actually been some really interesting ethnographic field studies over the past couple of years where people have actually gone out and talked to crowd workers that have revealed that crowd workers actually interact with each other a lot. So My colleague at Microsoft, Mary Gray, for example, went out and spent several months in India actually like finding people who worked on Mechanical Turk and going to their house and interviewing them and talking to them about their experience and everything. And in these interviews, she found that it was really common for people to do things like help each other with administrative overhead. This is especially true in India, where there's a lot of complications to even getting set up on Mechanical Turk and setting it up so that you can get paid. In some cases, she found people were like getting their payments sent to friends of theirs because it was hard to get it sent to them directly, things like that. She found that people shared a lot of information about tasks and reputable employers. So they would like recommend, requesters recommend tasks to each other. And something I think is really interesting is she found that they're kind of recreating social connections and support that are missing from crowdsourcing. So if you think about like the whole endeavor of crowdsourcing, it's basically taken the concept of work and taken all of the social aspects of work and sort of removed all of them and left only the kind of core work itself. And what people found in these field studies is that workers were actually like adding this social structure back in. So they would either, get together with people in person for the day when they were going to be doing crowd work, or they would, be chatting online the entire time that they were working, or things like this. They were kind of putting this social structure back in. And so we thought that these field studies were really interesting. They're basically painting this picture that, maybe these workers are not independent, but there's some sort of network structure going on here that we don't know about. And the questions that we wanted to get at in this last piece of work that I'm going to talk about are, what is the scale of this network? Is it just happened to be the case that the workers that she talked to were connected in this way? What is the structure of this network? And how is this network actually used? So we wanted to kind of understand basically, what this network looks like, how is it used, all of these things. So let me take just a second to comment on why this is actually a challenging question. So a lot of people, when I tell them about this work, they immediately think, oh, why don't you just go scrape this data? People are so used to thinking about things like, the Twitter network, where you can just go to Twitter and, scrape the entire network and figure out who talks to who. But this is not actually possible for something like Mechanical Turk, because this communication is not actually going on the platform. Mechanical Turk doesn't have a way for workers to talk to each other directly. So this is all sort of happening behind the scenes. Some of it is happening online on other forums, as we'll see, but it's not happening in any way that it's really easy for us to just go in and like download or scrape. And so basically to do this, we need some way to elicit this network from workers, so to get them to tell us who they talk to in such a way that, first of all, they would only tell us true edges. So this means, we don't want to go in and pay people per edge that they report in the network, because then, people clearly have motivation to make up more edges. But we still wanted to get kind of as many of these true edges as possible. And we wanted to do this in a way that preserves workers' privacy. So to try to get at this network, we ended up creating a web app that we posted kind of as a task that workers could come and do on Mechanical Turk. It just had just a base payment for coming to do the app. They got no additional payment for giving us extra edges. And because of that, we needed some way to kind of provide value back to workers. So we tried to do this by making it sort of as fun and interesting to them as we were able. Not being experts in making things like fun and interesting to people, we're at a little bit of a disadvantage here, but we tried. And so this app had basically 5 steps and sort of had the results of producing something that's like a mini social networking app for crowd workers. So workers first came in, and the first thing that we asked them to do is create a nickname for themselves that would be used for this app. So this was a unique nickname that other people could use to identify them. It's not supposed to be related to their real name or their Turker ID or anything identifiable. We then asked them to complete a brief demographics survey, asking them questions about their location, their gender, things like this, as well as questions about their Mechanical Turk usage. So things like what their approval rate is, which forms they use, whether they're Mechanical Turk master, which is this sort of nebulous status that it's not really clear exactly how you become a master, but some people are assigned by Amazon to be masters and then have access to more tasks. So we asked them things like that. We then asked them to tell us a little bit about their personal experience with Mechanical Turk in 2 questions. So we asked them 2 questions about basically like what motivates them to keep Turking and how they got into this. And going back to this idea of how useful pilot studies can be, we actually picked out these 2 questions by running a pilot study where we just asked a whole bunch of workers, what are the things that you're most interested in knowing about other people on Mechanical Turk? And these are the questions that like popped up most often as things that people were really interested to know about other workers. So this was sort of our attempt to give some value back by telling them some information about their colleagues on Mechanical Turk that they were interested to know. After we collected that, we asked them to swap nicknames with other workers, and then we allowed them to explore this kind of global Mechanical Turk worker network. And they were able to come back and add nicknames of other people later. Oh, I should say that by swapping a nickname with another worker, this is how you could kind of add them as somebody that you communicate with. So this is what the resulting network looked like. It's a little bit hard to see, but all of these nodes are on the outside are people who are isolated, whereas we have this kind of big connected group in the middle. We ended up getting about 10,000 workers to do this task, which I say is roughly a census of Mechanical Turk at the time, because according to some estimates and other work, people have estimated that there's maybe 7,000 or 8,000 people active on Mechanical Turk at any particular time. So we left this running for a month and got around 10,000. It seems like this is not every worker, but it's a pretty big portion of them. And we had about 5,000 connections reported here. I should say I think this is probably a dramatic underestimate of how much people are actually communicating with each other, because again, we didn't pay them extra for reporting these connections. These are just connections that people willingly reported to us and went out of their way to exchange nicknames with people they talked to and so on. So this is probably, if anything, I would say there's probably a lot more communication going on here than even this picture suggests. There are around 1,400 connected workers here. On average, the ones who are connected communicate with about 8 other workers, and the max degree worker here had degree 321. So there are people out there in the community who talk to a lot of other people. And the largest component includes about 1,000 of the workers, the largest connected component in this network. So one thing that is kind of interesting here, we did a lot of analysis on kind of different aspects of this network, but one thing that came out very clearly is that this network is really enabled largely by forums. So not all of this communication is over forums, but a lot of it is. So we found that about 59% of workers on Mechanical Turk and 83% of the workers who had at least one edge in this network reported that they use at least one forum. So forum usage is something that's really huge. So people, of course, knew before this that workers on Mechanical Turk are talking over forums, but I think this is kind of the first concrete estimate of what fraction of workers are doing this. And 90% of edges are between pairs of workers who communicate with each other over forums. So kind of interestingly, we actually are able to sort of separate this picture of the network into little overlapping clusters of workers by which forums they use. So here in each of these images, you guys can see these, we've colored in some color, like here it's green for Turker Nation. We've colored in as green every person who reported that they use this Turker Nation forum in the connected part of the graph. and we've colored in edges green if both people use Turk or Nation. And you can see that this network kind of has all of these little pockets of workers who all are kind of connected through the same forums that they use, although there's a huge amount of overlap here as well. We're also able to see that these various types of sub-communities created by these different forums are kind of different in some interesting ways, so I'm not going to go into a lot of detail, but the forums for these, or the networks for these different forums differed in things like topological structure, so how tightly connected is the community, temporal dynamics. So we looked at like whether people in this, who use this forum tended to just add communication links to people who joined, who did our task on the same day as them. So maybe in that case, they were just kind of going to the forum, looking around to see who else was there, swapping nicknames with them and adding them, or whether they would actually like come back 2 weeks later and add a link to somebody who they had missed the first time around. With the idea that, you know, if people were actually coming back later to our app to do this, then it likely means that they have kind of a deeper relationship that endures over time. And we found that, you know, people who use forums on Facebook, for example, were much more likely to come back later and add people, you know, a couple weeks later, as opposed to people who use like broadcast platforms like Reddit. Forums differed in what people tend to communicate with, so whether they're talking mostly about you know, business, meaning like which tasks are good, which requesters are good, what to avoid, and so on, or if people are also, you know, talking about their social day-to-day life. And this kind of paints a picture of this like spectrum of the forums that crowdworkers used, where on the one hand there are forums like Turk or Nation and Facebook, which seem to be kind of social communities, and on the other hand, there are forums like this Reddit Hits Worth Turking For forum, which tends to be more of a broadcasting platform where people are not really necessarily becoming close friends, but they're going there to kind of communicate information to each other that is like practical about the tasks that they're doing day to day. Good. And although we can't say anything causal from this data at all, I think it's worth mentioning that it seems that there may possibly be some informational advantages to workers from being connected. We at least saw correlations where connected workers were more likely to have been active on Mechanical Turk longer. They were more likely to use forums. They were more likely to have this master status. And they, on average, had a higher approval rate than workers who are not connected. Again, we can't infer too much from this, but it seems suggestive that there are informational advantages. And connected workers were also more likely to find our task early and complete it early, whereas unconnected workers were more likely to find it later. So a few takeaways from this. First, the takeaway, which I think is kind of most important to keep in mind for people who just want to kind of run things on Mechanical Turk, is that, you know, this forum usage is actually super widespread, and there is a lot of communication going on there. My colleagues Sid Suri and Mary Gray have a nice quote in one of their papers that forums are the virtual water cooler of crowd workers. So basically, these are where, you know, we've taken the social structure away from them. These forums are kind of where they go to have their like daily social conversations with coworkers, basically. And so, you know, it's good to be aware if you are running tasks on this platform that there is this whole kind of behind the scenes discussion going on, and a lot of workers are really engaged here. So related to this, I think it can be really useful in some cases to engage with workers on forums and to introduce yourself, introduce your tasks, and so on. It's kind of just a way to kind of build up some trust and also get some publicity for your tasks. And in fact, like when we were first, you know, again, coming back to the importance of piloting, you know, we were trying to run this this task where we were going to create this like large scale worker network. We did not want to release this entire task at one time, so we kind of released it in small batches to make sure that nothing was going to break. And when we were running early pilots, we did exactly this. We went on to specific forums and tried to advertise for people there in the hope that we would be able to attract people who all went there and talked to each other, so we would get at least a few links in our early versions. So this is a good thing to do in general. The other thing that is really super important, especially when running any sort of behavioral experiment or something like this on Mechanical Turk, which I think it's so important, but something that you never see written down in people's papers, is that it's good to always actively monitor forums for discussion about your task. And if you're running the type of experiment where it's really important that people in one treatment don't know about people in another treatment, then you should make sure that you actually ask workers to not discuss your task on forums. Workers in general, I found, are very well-meaning and willing to take you seriously if you ask them nicely about these types of things. So if you say, up front, this is a research project, please don't mention any details of this project on a forum, then people will often respect that. And I've even seen cases where a requester has said that, and then there has been discussion of the task on a forum, and other workers have come in and said, hey, we're not supposed to be talking about this, you need to stop talking about this. So people do, they actually respect this, which is great. But if you don't say this type of thing, people are not necessarily trying to harm your study, but maybe they don't know, in our task where we were giving some people performance-based payments and some people no payments, people might not necessarily realize that this is an experimental condition, so maybe they will mention something on a forum about, oh, go do this task, it has this nice surprise bonus that you're not expecting, and then other people go and they don't see this bonus, and it's kind of a disaster. So it's important to know what people are saying about your tasks behind the scenes. It's also useful, if you can realize if people are having problems with your tasks and come correct things and fix the problems. And the other takeaway from this is just to be careful in general about assuming independence of responses, because as we've seen, workers are not entirely independent, and I think it's still kind of an interesting open research question to figure out exactly how and on what tasks this matters, because maybe for some tasks it doesn't matter at all if the workers that you're seeing are not an independent sample, but maybe on some types of experiments it could matter a lot if you're sampling from this network as opposed to sampling from the population. So this is just kind of a thing to be cautious about. Okay, any questions about that before I go on? Yes.
Have you seen collusion? If the Turkers all talking to each other and they need to get 50% of the same, or 75 or 25% of the same typos, then do they post what they found as typos and screenshot?
We have not seen anything like that, but I don't know, you could easily imagine that type of thing happening, especially, looking at these ethnographic studies where they've found that, in some cases, people are actually sitting in a room next to somebody. If they're both doing the task at the same time, it seems very hard. It seems hard to detect that type of collusion, and it seems really hard to prevent it too. So I think there are not. I think that's a pretty small fraction of workers who are actually sitting in the room with someone, but that seems really hard to deal with.
So yeah. There's no organization like call center or stuff like that. There are people working together and crowd workers working in an office or something like that. That they all work together and share information. So it's more own work. People are more working from home.
As far as I know, for Mechanical Turk workers, I've not heard of anything like a big centralized place where everybody goes to work together. I mean, you could totally imagine something like that popping up, but
it can be complicated administratively. So maybe that we work together to simplify that process. I don't know.
Yeah.
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 Exactly.
Yeah. Yeah, okay. Good, so in the last couple of minutes, I just want to mention a few other miscellaneous best practices that don't necessarily tie in directly with the research studies that I've talked about, but I think are good things to mention. And I want to, before I even get into those, point people at this very good survey paper from 2012, Conducting Behavioral Research on Amazon's Mechanical Turk by Winter Mason and Sid Surrey, which is targeted at people who are doing behavioral research. So it does focus a lot on that, but actually contains a lot of tips that are generally useful for anybody who's using Mechanical Turk. And I always suggest that people use this as a source to figure out some of these tips. And some of the tips I'm going to talk about came from there, though not all of them. Okay. So first, I've already mentioned this several times at various points, but I think it's useful to generally try to maintain good relationships with workers. And this is especially the case if you're planning to use crowdsourcing regularly, because, as I mentioned, workers do talk to each other and tell each other about requesters that are good or bad. In addition to that, I found out pretty recently that there are some tools that are available to workers, like browser plugins and such that they can install, where they can actually keep a list of their favorite requesters and be notified immediately if their requesters have posted a task and things like this. So it's generally helpful to maintain good relationships. So to do this, I always tell people, if you're going to launch some new task, make sure that you do this at a time of day when you can actually be available to be around and actively monitoring your email account and responding to questions and so on, because, it does turn out that tasks are buggy in ways that you don't expect all the time, and you don't want to go away for a few hours or overnight and come back to 100 angry emails from workers who are all not getting paid, right? It's good if you can kind of be there, at least when you first launch a task, to make sure everything's going well. I always tell people to approve work quickly when you can, just because this is generally something that workers appreciate. Avoid rejecting work, as I've already mentioned, unless it's a really extreme circumstance, because, you just don't want to, you want to err on the side of kind of giving workers the benefit of the doubt here, just because rejecting work can be really harmful to them. So not only do they not get paid for your task, but if you reject their work, at least on Mechanical Turk, this means that their overall approval rate is going down, and now in some cases, requesters will filter by approval rate, so that means that you've potentially just cut off their access to other work that they might be doing. And for somebody who's doing this to make a living, this is a really big deal. So you just don't mess with people's approval rates unless you have a really good reason to. And generally, just strive to be an ethical requester. Keep in mind that these are real people. And if you don't know what that means, there are these nice guidelines that have been put up as part of this Project Dynamo that Michael Bernstein and others were involved in. And they've actually set up this entire wiki with a bunch of guidelines for academic requesters and kind of ways that you can be ethical and be a good requester and all of that. So I encourage people to look at this as well. In terms of just some tips to make projects run smoothly, I've already mentioned this many times, but I think you should pilot absolutely everything that you're going to do. First of all, just test any tasks out on collaborators, students, colleagues, friends, anybody you can get to do them, and then run them on small batches of workers. I always almost want to break this rule myself, just because by the time you have some new task ready to launch, it's so exciting, and you're I'm just gonna launch 1,000 of these, but it's a very bad idea, because you don't know what's going to go wrong, and it's much better to do things in small batches and iterate. And related to that, one of the real advantages of platforms like Mechanical Turk is that you do have this great ability to iterate in ways that you don't in other kind of experimental platforms. Because you can just, you can throw up 10 copies of your task, see what happens, and if something seems to be going wrong, you can easily just kind of fix this and relaunch, and it takes basically none of your time, and you can just kind of keep tweaking things to get the results that you want. So I think these are both super important, crucial points, and I would say if you take away like one practical tip from this talk, it should be this. Just for a few other miscellaneous things, it's always a good idea to create clear instructions. You can potentially include quiz questions and instructions if you think that this would be helpful, just to kind of make sure that people understand what you're asking them to do. Again, this is something that it's worth piloting. I think piloting instructions can actually be extremely useful because the instructions may seem clear to you, but that doesn't mean that other people will understand what you want them to do. I've also mentioned already the importance of creating an attractive and easy to use interface, which is something that a ton of people ignore, but I think it makes a huge difference. It's kind of a shame because this is something that it's rarely mentioned in papers also, and you don't really get a lot of credit in papers for the beautiful interface for your task that you've designed, but it's pretty important if you want to actually get people to do your task and do a good job. And finally, I would say, feel free to ask workers for feedback, ask them to report bugs, use exit surveys if that is an appropriate thing to do for your task. And generally, in my experience, I found that workers really do want to help you out. Just like this example I mentioned, where if you tell people not to talk about the task, they take this really seriously. Also, these slides and eventually this video will be there as well. And that is all. Thank you. And you guys have been here a really long time, but if people have more questions, I'm happy to take a few or talk to people offline or